Hello and welcome back to Storytime with Alex. We're now on chapter 7 of From Albion to Britannia, book 2, The Last Witch of Old Albion. Miles has a suspicion that Mr. Campbell may be the person stealing the cats, and he's met up with Rose, who is the last witch of Old Albion, and Father Bennett, who was actually the Abbot back over 300 years ago. And he's going to tell them their story. Now, this is quite a long chapter, so I've decided to split into two. So this will be 7a, I guess. The story of the Abbot and his keys, which has been told by Father Bennett. Rose has told you what happened at the tower and the destruction of the Black Cauldron. I miss seeing it because I was carrying Rose into her cottage after she had fallen from the oak tree. I'd laid her on her bed and was fetching a bowl of water to clean her up when there was a shudder and I spilt water on the floor. I think that must have been the moment when the world changed, but I just mopped the water off the flagstones and carried on. Shortly after, Sebastian Jones limped in, with a bandage wrapped around his head and various cuts and bruises and bits of twig in his hair. He told me what had happened. I sat him down and put the kettle on to boil, and started to worry about my brother monks. 12 of them had come with me, and they had gone out into the wood. The plan was to make a wide circle around the tower to pray for protection and victory over evil, and I wondered that they had not started to return to Rose's cottage. I tended to Rose and Sebastian, and then I went out to find them. I followed the path through the trees, expecting to find a pile of rubble in a deep hole, but the ruins of the tower seemed to have been there for years already. The circular wall was a couple of feet high, and there was a pile of stones where the staircase had been, but grass was beginning to grow up through the tiles on the floor, and plants trailed across the wall and over the pile of stones. That was when I began to wonder what had happened. Had the spirit of the land tidied this place up? I searched for my brothers for a time, but found no sign of them. Had they returned to the Abbey without me? It seemed odd. I returned to Rose's cottage, and the 3 of us drank chamomile tea with honey and ate toast. None of us had timepieces, that not being a priority in Albion, but it started to grow dark, and it was time for me to return to the Abbey for Compline. That's the last time of prayer of the day before monks go to bed. We go to bed early and awaken well before dawn. I set off for the Abbey. I walked along the road that is now the motorway, though without the great banks on either side, and found my way to a side gate into the Abbey grounds. The gateway was there, and it still is. If you come across the footbridge, you must have passed through it. The gate was there, but it was locked. I drew out my bunch of keys and unlocked it, wondering who had locked it before Compline, for it was never locked until Compline had finished. I passed through it and made my way through the vegetable gardens. On reflection, they seemed a little different, but dusk was falling and I was eager to get home. I walked past this pond where we are sitting now, it was for fish rather than ducks, and looked over to the chapel. I was wondering why the bell was not ringing for Compline, and I had a terrible shock. Even after all these years, I remember exactly how I felt. The bell tower was missing. I should have been able to see it against the skyline as the sun set in the west. Then I realised to my horror that the chapel had gone. There was nothing there but a pile of ruins. "They're still there," gasped Ruth. "They are indeed, though even less of them than were then." First I thought that the chapel must have fallen when the tower exploded, but as I drew near I could see that the ruins were already old. Briars grew through them, and ivy split over the tops of the broken walls. The house where we lived, with the kitchen and the library, was still standing, and there were lights coming on in many of the rooms, but it was different too. Excuse me. Thank you. I hid among the stones and looked. There was a woman coming out of the kitchen with a bucket of vegetable scraps that she poured into a trough. Happy pigs came to eat them. There were no women in the Abbey. 3 young men, dressed strangely, or so I thought at the time, walked past the ruins where I was hiding, laughing and drinking from a flagon. I crossed myself and said many prayers for protection and for understanding. When the young men entered the house, I fled back down the path and returned to Rose's cottage. By then Rose had awoken, and we shared with her what had happened to the tower, and what had just happened to me. I started to weep for my brother monks. Where were they? What had happened to them? The next morning I accompanied Sebastian, who wished to return to his tower beyond the river, but it was a similar tale. The bridge was different, quite newly built. The quiet meadows where Sebastian's tower stood were covered with people living in makeshift camps. We learned that they were refugees from the city, for London had been ravaged by plague and fire. Where his tower had been, a row of houses stood. There was no one there he knew, and no one who knew him. We had realised as we walked along that people were staring at our robes. All the men we met wore breeches. Luckily, we both wore long cloaks, and at least had not gone out of fashion, so we wrapped them around ourselves. We returned to Rose's cottage, and there we stayed, for neither of us had any other home. Sebastian swapped some of Rose's honey cakes for a pair of trousers and some boots, and took to wandering around, talking to people, finding out about this world where we had found ourselves. One day we arose early and walked up to London and back, and told us how much had changed. He told us about what is called the Reformation, when abbeys like mine had been taken from the monks who lived there and given to friends of the king. Later, there were people who deliberately destroyed the churches. Terrible times. I said my offices, my prayers, for I had been a monk most of my life and knew them off by heart, and I tried to work out what to do. Rose and I would go and tend to the refugees from the city, and that gave us purpose. I too traded for some more suitable clothes, and sadly folded up my monk's habit, not knowing what tomorrow might bring. You must have visited Rose's cottage. So you have visited Rose's cottage. Obviously, they met him there. No, they didn't. They met him at Miss P's cottage. I'm rambling. I'll just read the book. You know that it's not very big. It was made for one person to live in. There were 3 of us there, and we began to annoy one another. Sebastian is quite tall and would knock his head on the beams. His very height began to oppress me when we were all there together. I was told, in no uncertain terms, by both Sebastian and Rose that I snored loudly. We could not all live there, but what were we to do? Then one night I had a dream. In my dream I was back in the abbey. My dreams often started like that. Sometimes they still do. We were saying the terce prayer, and there was a loud knocking on the door. For some reason we were all terrified and started to hide under our chairs. Someone called out, "We must hide the chalice," for the vessels for the Eucharist were on the altar for some reason. In the dream I picked up the chalice and looked wildly around. The knocking came again, even louder and more insistent, and I woke on my pile of blankets on the floor of Rose's cottage. As I lay there, recovering from the dream, accepting that I was not clutching the chalice, and that there was no one to fear outside the door, I started to reflect on life at the abbey. It may be that after so much time, Rose and I see old Albion through the rose-tinted spectacles of nostalgia. It was our world and we loved it, but it was not perfect. There were greedy people and lazy people who would rather steal than earn their bread. There were occasional bands of robbers, and all abbeys and monasteries had somewhere safe to keep the precious objects in their care, such as the chalice and paten for communion. They were sometimes made of gold and silver and jewels, not to show off the wealth of the religious houses, but made to the glory of God. St. Mary's Abbey had such a place, not a safe that robbers could easily discover, but a hidden place only known to the abbot and the prior, who assist the abbot, so that no one else would have the responsibility of keeping the secret from those who might steal from us. All I had of the abbey were my keys. He paused and reached deep into his cassock pockets and drew out a heavy set of keys. They were a sign that I was the abbot, and I still like to keep them on me, even though there is not a lock they would open nowadays. This is a key that still could unlock the side gate in those days, and these are the keys to doors that even then had been long destroyed and taken for firewood. But one of these keys, this one, this small plain iron key, was the key that opened a secret cupboard with an iron door hidden under a stone panel under the abbot's chair in the chapel. I wondered what had happened when the soldiers came to throw out the monks and take the riches of the abbey. One of my keys had opened the gate. Would this other little key still have its keyhole? And would there be anything in the secret cupboard? It seemed unlikely, but it also seemed worth a try. I used to keep a small bag of gold coins there. Sometimes people would give them to me to do good works, and there they would go until they were spent. But the abbey was no longer mine, not even the ruins of the chapel. I could not risk anyone seeing me searching, could I? When Rose and Sebastian awoke, I told them my idea, and Sebastian, who was always much more worldly wise than me, and a better liar, came up with an idea. We would present ourselves at the front door and say that we were herbalists looking for rare plants, and that we had heard that sometimes they could be found in the ruins of monasteries. Hopefully they would let us go and look, and we could see if the secret cupboard was still there, and so, later that day, we put the plan into action. Sebastian can be very charming when he wants. He had the sense not to knock on the front door, but to ask at the kitchens. The steward of the house came, looking suspiciously at these two slightly oddly dressed strangers. But after Sebastian had explained eloquently about the herbs that might still be growing wild among the ruins, I began to believe that it was true, and we were given permission to look about the ruins as long as we showed the steward any plants we found. We would need to persuade Rose to come with us, as she had a wide knowledge of herbs, and would, with luck, find something to impress the steward. The next day the three of us returned with a trug and a little digger, and were allowed to set about our task. Before we get too cold sitting here, let's walk over to the ruins, and I'll show you what's left. The ruins in the big park are very clean and tidy, with flower beds full of rose bushes. They're surrounded by iron railings. There's a sign explaining that they are the remains of St. Mary's Abbey. Father Bennett, Abbot Joseph, traced a finger across the sign and sighed. At first we thought that the plan had failed, as the steward came along and watched us fossicking about among the stones. We had no chance to look for the secret place. Luckily, it was quite boring to watch other people peer at little plants, so after a little time he went off to get on with his own work. As soon as he was gone, Sebastian and I set about trying to work out where the cupboard might be. I remember being quite happy to continue looking for herbs, Rose chuckled. I almost forgot why we'd actually come. It was a strange task to stand here among the ruins of a building I remembered walking about only a week or two before. It was quite painful to be there then. I remembered my lost brother monks and prayed to God for forgiveness for losing them. As an abbot, they were my responsibility. He led us around the railings until he found what he was looking for. There, he pointed. Do you see that wall? There was more of it left then. It was the wall of the chapel, where there had been a rose window, a round window of stained glass. There was enough of the wall remaining in those days to see at the top just a little of the stone tracery that would have held the glass, and when we looked closely we even found tiny fragments of ancient coloured glass almost buried in the soil. I picked them all up and put them in my pocket. I have them still. There are one or two that I missed, that were left there till modern times, when they were gathered up by the borough archaeologists. They are in the local history museum, just over there, where the house stood that was built with the stones from the abbey. Having found the wall, I stood before it, closed my eyes, and imagined that I was standing in the chapel as I remembered it. The reredos, the stone carving behind the altar, and the altar itself, and then the steps before it and the rood screen, then the choir stalls on either side where the monks sat, and at the other end, in the middle, the abbot's chair. I opened my eyes and walked slowly forward, trying to keep the image in my mind. I stopped where I thought the chair should be, and making sure there was no one about, Sebastian and I cleared away the leaves and plants that were growing there. I remember a clunk as the end of the little metal digger hit stone. We peeled away the soil, and there was the stone floor. You know, when people started to excavate historical sites as archaeologists in the 20th century, brought all this back. I started to join archaeological digs. I was delighted when they started to make television programmes like Time Team. Anyway, we located the stone in the floor and cleared away all around it, hoping no one was going to take any further interest in us. We needed to lift it out, but it was welded into place by time and little roots, and it took 3 of us to free it and lift it out. It was getting late and beginning to grow darker. I peered into the hole the stone had left, and there was the door, and there was the keyhole. I prayed a quick prayer, crossed myself, and pushed the key into the lock. It fitted, but refused to turn. Many years had passed since this lock had been opened. Sebastian, who even then seemed to be quite versed in these nefarious happenings, produced a tiny vial of lamp oil from his pocket and poured some of it in the lock. This time, with much squeaking, the key turned and the door was unlocked. There was a ring set into the door, which I prized up and pulled the door. Again it was stuck, and Sebastian applied more lamp oil to the hinges. This time, when I pulled the door open, inside there was a soft leather bag which I could see held a chalice and a paten. But there was something else, a brass-bound chest about 1 foot long. I tried to lift it and nearly fell over. Whatever it contained was very heavy. I bet the boots on my foot that chest contains gold, said Sebastian. We must take it home with us. How can we? I said. Someone will see us. Then we must return at night and take it then, he said quite merrily. For this was not the life I had been living, and not the life I was trained for. But he was right. We needed places to live, We needed all the things that a person needs to live a life in society, and this was our only chance. We closed the iron door, replaced the stone, and covered it over with soil. Then we took Rose's collection of herbs and plants to show the steward, who pretended to know about them, but clearly didn't. We returned to Rose's cottage and waited. In the middle of the night we returned to the Abbey ruins with a lantern and well-oiled wheelbarrow from Rose's garden shed. We managed to lift the chest and get it into the barrow and away home. While on the road, strangers approached, and Rose sat in the barrow on top of the chest and sang silly songs and pretended to be drunk while we trundled her home. When we got into the cottage, we placed the chest on the table. It also had a lock, but I had no key to fit it. In the end, Sebastian managed to unlock it using one of Rose's hairpins. It contained 6 leather bags. In each were 20 gold coins, stamped with a pattern none of us recognised. Under the bag there was a small piece of parchment with something written in Latin. It said, "This gold is the property of Edward, the last abbot of St. Mary's Abbey, Albury. A curse upon anyone else who takes it for their own." "There," said Sebastian, "it belongs to you." Whoever he was not the last abbot after all. "So what did you do with all that gold?" I asked. "Quite boring, really. I bought property and invested it wisely. I own all the land in Albury Triangle, including an overlooked corner where you and I know a witch resides, and a tall house in the East End with a wizard on the top floor, and a flat in Edinburgh, which I'm probably going to sell." "Shall I tell you something about Albury Triangle?" Father Bennett said, smiling at me. "Most people who live there think the houses were arranged in those 3 roads because of the railway and the main road that is now a motorway. But if you were to look at old maps of the area, those 3 roads have been there a very long time. Even when there were no houses, there was a triangular path, so that when I first bought the land, I had those 3 roads created. The place where the tower stood in old Allbyon is at the dead centre. Although we blocked and obliterated the entrance to the thin place, we cannot destroy it. The 3 roads are a sort of spell. The wizard Sebastian created it as warding, a spell to keep the place peaceful and unaffected by the thin place and by the bridge when it forms. When the railway was being built, I worked very hard to keep our triangle intact, not to mention the path under the railway to Rose's garden. Every few years Sebastian still comes and walks the triangle in the dead of night, chanting his spell very quietly so that no one will wake up and see him." "I saw him once," I cried, "one night when the foxes woke me up. I always wondered who he was and what he was doing. And there is Miss P, the warden, and the wardens before her, and Rose in her cottage, all those people looking after us, and we don't know anything about them." "Ruth and I are a part of that now. Ruth and you are a part of that now," said Father Bennett. "I hope you don't feel it's too much for you." "Oh no," we both said together, and laughed. Then I said, "I'm sure you've thought of this already, but it does seem to me that the simplest way to stop Mr. Campbell would be to get the cats back. Then there's no risk of anyone finding out about the magic. If it is him, he must be keeping the cats somewhere. Rose, do you have any spells that could find the cats?" "That's a very good idea, Miles. I will try. What I do think is important, though, is that you go to this ATRAG meeting on Saturday." I wondered if my parents would go to the meeting. I didn't think they would let me go on my own, but on Tuesday evening our cat Misty went missing. We had virtually locked him up by putting a heavy box in front of his cat flap. We would let him out once a day when we were all in and keep an eye on him. I came home on Tuesday and the box had been pushed away from the cat flap and Misty had gone out. Dad had been the last person to leave the house that morning and swore that the box was where it should be. It dawned on me, though I didn't say, that someone could have used a brush handle or something to push the box away from the outside. If Mr. Campbell needed 12 cats, he would have to get hold of Misty. I went next door and told Miss P. Gremlin didn't go out a great deal, and had a litter tray indoors, but it seemed to me that we needed to be very careful. The one good thing that came out of it was that Mum and Dad both said they would come to the meeting. Although I was not going to break into Mr. and Mrs. Campbell's house, I did walk around Albury Gardens after school a couple of times and try to peer over his fence, but it was not only taller than me, there was a thick clump of prickly bushes in the way. I went and stood on the hump in the middle of the gardens, but I was too far away to see anything. As I stood there, it dawned on me that I was standing on the spot where the tower had stood. I wonder if there were any ruins underneath the grass. I finally climbed one of the trees in the garden and saw into his back garden. There were no suspicious sheds, and I realised that if he had the cats, they would have to be somewhere where no one could hear them mewing. Misty was not going to be pleased to have been kidnapped, and I don't suppose the other cats were either. And that's where I'm going to stop for now, but come back and find out what happens at the ATRAG meeting, which I think is what's going to happen next. See you there.